The company GamesCare has just released an updated version of their SCART switch with both auto and manual switching, as well as Wi-Fi control. It passed all the safety tests that I threw at it and didn't seem to add any interference, so this one's a good buy. Stick around if you'd like to see it demoed and tested, but if you'd rather just buy it and see for yourself, the link's in the description. If that's the case, maybe let the video play out anyway, because, algorithms? Anyway, let's get to it. Using the switch is about as easy as it gets. Just plug in your RGB SCART cables and power on your console. If you've got your whole system connected through a power switch like I do, you'll need to wait for the switch to boot before it auto switches to your console. It'll power up, then show its current IP address, then it'll show the name of the console, but more on that later. If you power on a second console, it'll switch to that. If you need to manually switch between the two, simply hit the I/O button to toggle between inputs. To go back to automatic mode, just hold the I/O button for 5 seconds. Careful though, because holding the I/O button for 15 seconds does a full factory reset, so just don't hold the button down too long. Oh, and the reset button reboots the switch. You probably won't need to use this, and you could always just power cycle, but it's there if you need it. Now let's take a look at Wi-Fi functionality. To access, simply connect your phone or computer to the switch's wireless network and wait. The default setting will automatically bring up a web browser with the switch's controls in it. The first page that comes up will let you manually toggle between the ports. Oh, and noticed how they're all pre-named? It was just a coincidence that I plugged Genesis into port 1 and SNES into port 2. I gotta admit, it did freak me out a little bit when I turned on my Super Nintendo and the switch said SNES, and then when I plugged in the Nomad and the switch said Genesis, because I thought it would take a pretty expensive processor to auto-detect what signal is being fed to it. But once I saw the names that were just pre-written in the app, I laughed. I thought, okay, what a very fun coincidence that I would have put Genesis and Super Nintendo in the same slots that were already pre-written. But you can just use the app to rename it whatever you do have plugged into it. The next page lets you change your Wi-Fi settings. The default setting of the access point and portal is my favorite, as that's what automatically brings up the page as I just showed. You could set it to just access point mode, but then you'll need to manually connect and navigate to the IP address each time you want to access it. People will probably use that mode the least, however, there's a client mode that will let you connect the switch to your wireless network. That lets you access the switch from any device on your home network. So just pay attention to the IP address that the switch gives you upon boot, or bookmark it if you never turn the switch off, and that's all you'd have to do to access it. Then just save your settings so they'll persist even after a power cycle, and you could reboot here if you made any Wi-Fi changes. One more thing to mention is the expansion port on the side that will allow future upgrade modules that lets you add more input ports to the same switch. More on that when they become available. Overall though, that's basically all you need to know for your average use case. It's a fully auto switch that if you choose to, you could use in manual mode either via the button or the app. But let's check out some non-standard use cases as well. It's pretty common that people with mostly RGB SCART consoles has at least one that only outputs component video. One great example of this is people that want to use the original Xbox in 480p and higher modes. RetroRGB sells a component over SCART cable for the original Xbox for this exact reason, and you could even just use PlayStation 2 RGB SCART cables as component video. Just switch the menu to YPVPR. As long as the switch supports component video pass-through, and most importantly, as long as you have a target device that can support component via SCART, like the RetroTink 4K, the OSSC, or many PVMs and BVMs, then this is a great option. I have a Nomad with component video cables here to demonstrate this, so let's see if it switches automatically. Nope. So let's double check just to be thorough. Okay, so I brought back the Super Nintendo with RGB SCART cable, and you can see it automatically switched to the correct input. I'll turn the Nomad back on, and once again, nothing happens. So it looks like the switch won't automatically pass through component, but let's try manual switching. I went back into the app and confirmed it's still in auto mode. Now I'll power on the SNES and you can see the switch work, but if I press the input in app, it does manually switch to the component console. See, both the screen and the blue light show that. I'll show you here what the RetroTink 4K sees as it switches between inputs. First, we have the SNES and RGB mode, but as we switch over to the component video console, the signal drops. No problem, just change the input to YPBPR over SCART, and now it's working. That would be the same with any device that accepts multiple signals over SCART, like the OSSC or any PVM where you could just toggle between RGB and component. So that's basically it. The switch will pass through component, you just need to manually select the input, either through the app like I showed here, or just by pushing the button right on the switch itself. Like with component video, another common scenario is to have mostly RGB consoles with maybe one composite video console in the mix. I'll repeat the same test with the SNES powered on, but it's just sitting off camera. And as we power on the NES, nothing. So just like with component video, you'll need to manually switch composite. It does pass through fine though, so both are really no big deal at all. As a note, if you're using RGB SCART cables that sync on composite video, those should auto switch. Those cables are pretty cool for people that want the choice of both signal types all in one cable. Now I want to show how I determined that this switch doesn't hurt the video quality at all. This is where the more technical part of the video starts, so it's totally okay if you want to drop off, but, once again, maybe let it play to feed the old algorithm. But I do hope you'll stick around just so I can show proof of why this thing is a good switch to use. So first, we need a control test. Here's an SNES connected directly to the RetroTink 4K using fully shielded RGB SCART cables that sync on composite video. Now we'll just take a screenshot of a game with a lot of blue on the screen. As we zoom in, you'll see a bit of diagonal analog video interference, but it's not bad at all. Basically what you'd expect. Now let's run the same test, but with the console connected to the switch. We have another shielded SCART cable going from the switch to the RetroTink 4K. As a note, if you ever want to run a test like this yourself, make sure you're using this exact type of cable, a fully shielded RGB SCART cable that syncs on composite video. This type of cable won't have any interference. However, if the switch or whatever device you're testing in between is poorly routed, it'll be exactly as if you connected an unshielded cable in between. And it's the same. That's excellent. That means the switch isn't adding any video interference at all. Now let's test it with another console powered on at the same time. And for this console, we're going to use a really low quality, unshielded sync-on composite cable. Basically, we're sending interference down the switch to see if it leaks over to the SNES's signal. And once again, no change. This is a quick and easy way to prove this switch doesn't add any interference to the video signal that's passed through it. One unfortunate thing we need to deal with when using RGB SCART for video games these days is improper voltage. Now, if any cable or device is built to spec, voltage is never an issue, but many cables and devices are not built to spec. So let's whip out the old scope and see how this one performs. First, we'll start by plugging the SNES running the 240p test suite and 100% color bars right into the scope. This is to get a baseline reading of all four signals. Sync is showing about 400 millivolts. You always have to test sync first with a scope like this so you can set the trigger. Check out a video I did with Steve from HD Retrovision a few years ago for detailed instructions. Then we'll test red, showing about 750 millivolts. Blue and green are about the same, but green is a tiny bit lower. This is totally normal with stock unmodified consoles, by the way. The tolerance in the components will often show a variance in colors. Okay, now we'll repeat the same test, but through the GamesCare switch. I'll connect it to the SNES, then use the same shielded SCART cable from before to connect the switch to the scope. As we go through all the voltages again, we could see the exact same readings as when it was connected directly. Heck, even the slight green discrepancy remained, proving the switch does absolutely nothing to the voltages, which is exactly what we want. This switch just seems to pass through whatever it's fed, which means it should never be the cause of any voltage-related problems. Now, as always, regardless of what switch or devices you're using, just make sure to use well-built cables like all of the ones linked on RetroRGB.com and try to stay away from badly built super guns, and you should be fine. One last thing to test is how dual output works. One of the SCART outputs is currently connected to the RT4K, which I'll disconnect for now. The other is connected directly to the scope so we can watch the voltage in real time. If the circuit is built correctly, there will be no change in voltage for one or two outputs. Right now, I'm unplugging and replugging the SCART cable into the RT4K, and you can see there's no change at all in the voltage. That proves that there's proper circuitry on the board, and it's 100% safe to use both single and dual output. So overall, this switch was excellent. It passed every test I threw at it, and I really like that there's still a manual button on the switch to toggle inputs. I think the Wi-Fi app is really cool, but I would have been concerned if it was the only way to access the switch. But the fact that you just have a simple button that you could press covers you for every scenario. My only complaint, if I had to say one, is that the SCART ports have a bit of a death grip to them, but I'd much rather have them be too snug than too loose. Just make sure to squeeze the SCART head while removing it and never try to unplug by pulling on the cable itself. The only other thing to note about this switch is it doesn't include a sync stripper, which is totally fine. There are very few scenarios these days where you would actually require a sync stripper, and they're often the cause of some sync issues when they're put in the wrong place. And also, having a basic sync stripper built into the switch might not always be the best place to put it anyway. If you're going to an Extron device or the rare RGB monitor that requires TTL sync, you'll need to feed it D-sub or BNC anyway, so an external box like the SCART cleaner is probably a better option. If for whatever reason you do need special sync requirements, the G-SCART switch's sync regeneration is far more advanced than any basic sync stripper circuit anyway, so that's the better option for those scenarios. It lacks any easy manual control though, so each of these switches has a slight advantage over the other. If you're on a budget, you could get the all-manual SCART switch from RetroRGB cables. That was also fully tested by me and works great, just with no extra features. And I think that's the perfect place to end this video, with my recommendation for my 3 favorite SCART switches. You have the 8x2 automatic G-SCART switch that's been around forever and has awesome sync regeneration. You have this 8x2 GamesCare switch that's both fully automatic and has the 2 manual modes as well. And if you're on a budget, or if you don't need any of the extra features, you have the lower-priced RetroRGB cables manual push-button switches. All are excellent, all perform absolutely awesome, and you should just choose whichever fits your setup and your budget best. Well, that's it for this time. If you liked this video, consider helping the channel out by using affiliate links to get the same stuff you were going to get from Amazon and eBay at the exact same price, but we get a small cut. Also, if you really like this channel, please consider signing up for any of the monthly support services, as that's what's keeping all this going. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.